Our next speaker is Dr. Ann Braaten. Dr. Braaten taught in the apparel, retail merchandising, and design program for over 32 years before her retirement in late 2023 from North Dakota State University in Fargo. In addition, she served as curator of the Emily Reynolds Historic Costume Collection at North Dakota State, an archive of over 5,000 clothing and textile items that reflect the history of the region, the history of fashion, and international dress. She was an affiliate faculty member of the Women and Gender Studies program at North Dakota State. Her research focuses on historic dress and textiles as a means of examining women's roles and contributions to the family, fashion, and business. The title of her presentation is Ethnic Textiles and Clothing of the Germans from Russia.
My name's Ann Braaten, and I just retired from North Dakota State University after teaching there 32 and a half years. And while there, I worked with the Emily Reynolds Historic Costume Collection, and we collected, along with the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection, ethnic textiles and clothing of the Germans from Russia. Let's see if I can advance. There we go. And so with the collection that we have, let's see if I can get this out of the way. With the collection we have, the Emily Reynolds costume collection has over 5,000 pieces in it. And the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection includes textiles and clothing. And that collection was established in 1994 when I was on a new faculty trip with Michael Miller and other people that were faculty members just coming in at that time. And we traveled to German Russian country in the southeastern and central and south central portions of North Dakota to learn about the Germans from Russia. And he knew that there were a lot of textiles that people had and thought it would be a good thing to add to our collection to have a better understanding of this unique ethnic group in North Dakota. Since that time, we have broadened the collection, and people from all over the United States and Canada have donated things to the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection. One of the things that's quite common with the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection is this map of 19th century German villages in South Russia. It's one of 3 maps that show different groups with the German names during the 19th century. More modern day maps have are Romanian or German, Ukrainian names. And so it's hard to find ancestral villages without a map like this, because the names have changed and of the villages. And so it's a good thing to have. And I made use of that as I began to study the shawls. My overall question was, what can be learned from the many shawls that were being donated to the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection? And what can you learn about women's experience? Because what it seemed as though the shawls were always passed through the women's side of the family, and women are the keepers of textiles and clothing, and they're generally the ones that wash and iron and make sure that family wardrobes are up to date and fitting them. And so it's interesting to see the collage of the shawls on the left and the right. We have shoulder shawls that are a little bit thicker and bigger, that are big enough to wrap around and hold in front of the body, or and serve as a way to keep people warm in the cold weather. Then the one with the black fringe, those are head shawls. And so we could see that there are at least 2 different types of shawls that were donated. And so as I worked with my doctoral program, I had to select a topic for what I'd be spending a couple years writing my dissertation, research and writing my dissertation. And as I drove back and forth between Fargo and the University of Minnesota, where I studied, it seemed as though studying German-Russian textiles would add a knowledge base to the collection that is part of the institution that I was working at. So that's what I chose to do. And so with the program that I was in at the University of Minnesota, material culture studies was an important aspect of that, and an important way to get at primary source materials like textiles are, but they don't talk, they don't, you can't read them in a way that you can read text, but yet you can learn from them. And so I made use of framework from Joan Severa and Merrill Horswell from the publication Dress in 1989 that looked at costume as material culture. And Joan Severa was on faculty at the University of Wisconsin, and took information that was available about material culture studies and then translated that to the study of clothing. With her article, she built on Mary Ellen Roach Higgins and Miss Musa's, I can't remember her name, but anyway, Roach and Musa's study on the modal types from 1982. And with modal types, it refers to time, and modal refers to time. So the question is, are items, or the statement is, are items from similar times as you look at series of objects, a series of clothing, and were they made by similar people? And so one of the things that you can see, like with handwriting, you can tell if somebody's handwriting is from that person or if somebody else has, signed their name. And the same is with clothing that's handmade or even machine-made clothing. There are techniques and crafts and things of that sort that show the similarity and an understanding of the skill of those people. So the modal types also ask and remind people that during a particular time, people refer visually and in their minds to similar forms of dress. And so if you think of dress right now, we kind of, with women's fashions, there's a change going on right now between a very slim fitted pant and a wider leg pant. And it's interesting to look at the wider legs when people are used to skinny leg pants and try to adapt to them. And so that would be one example. But if you look back and maybe 10 years or 20 years at family pictures, you're able to kind of identify the people not only by how big they are, but what type of glasses are they wearing, what kind of shirts or hairstyles do they have. And so our appearance and our clothing are markers of a particular time period. Then a statement that was just, it had meaning to me. Similar forms are the synthesis of cultural patterns which influenced a person's choice. And so we synthesize all these patterns that we learn from our parents, from our friends, from our school, from what we see in pop culture or read. And those all influence our choice. And so it's interesting to consider that and how that makes a difference in how people choose to dress themselves. Severa and Merrill Horswell, Severa and Horswell's framework also built on E. McClung Fleming's study that's called Artifact Study, a Proposed Model. And with his work, he studied furniture, but he wrote his framework or created his framework in a broad enough way for it to be applied to other things. And so he based the initial analysis on gathering the history, examining the material, the construction, considering the design of the object, the function of the object. But then when you have that information on one or more of the things that you've examined, with as far as the physical properties of the artifact, then carry out operations, including identification, evaluation, how well is it made? How has it fallen apart? Where was its use? With the cultural analysis, who used it? Where did they use it? What time of day? What season of the year? What was their life like? Were they self-sufficient? Were they part of culture that is more of an urban culture that is based on a cash economy? And then to take those things and interpret that, and use your imagination and what you know about the present to try to consider how people made use of these things in the past. And so there's some speculation involved, but it's kind of a fun step to do. Severa and Horswell also um, made use of Philip Zimmerman's workmanship as evidence article. And in it, Zimmerman said that workmanship, Zimmerman speaks of the workmanship of habit, the habit of the way that you organize your writing on a page, or the way that you format a document that you are writing. And so, that workmanship of habit tells a lot about an object as well. The other thing that they cautioned in their article is that a high degree of literacy about the subject under evaluation is needed to correctly read the artifact on its many levels. And so with studying textiles, in particular shawls, I have a good understanding of textiles. I probably have taken and taught 30 plus classes relating to textiles. Where I needed to really study and get a better understanding is on German Russian history and culture. And so the process that I used in studying the shawls of the Germans from Russia was to examine things that were in the NDSU collection, as well as to reach out with the assistance of Michael Miller, the director at that time of the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection, to contact private collections and collectors who had shawls within their possession. And so I was able to take a look at what people had inherited or had collected over time. And so there were over 40 shawls that I looked at, and I classified them using the framework set up by Severa and Horswell. I also gathered oral histories that, as I interviewed them, I recorded and took notes on the histories. And many people had written family histories, and I poured over those to highlight information that related to textiles and clothing, or wool processing, or life as it was through time. What did they have to do as they were preparing to leave Russia for America or wherever they happened to emigrate to? And so I mentioned I studied the scholarship of Germans from Russia. I searched for photographs from the original immigrants, but these things were a little bit difficult to find. The people who homesteaded on the plains of North Dakota, it was a hard scrabble life. It took a while for people to have enough money to afford to pay for a photographer to sit at a photographer's studio, or with itinerant photographers that came around. And so that was a liability, because here we have flat textiles, and without seeing how they were worn, there's some mystery that's involved there. And so there were more photographs of women wearing head shawls, but I really had a hard time finding pictures of women wearing the shoulder shawls. The other thing that was important to the study was I asked where the immigrants from Russia, where they originated, what villages were they from? And I mapped those out, making use of the map produced by the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection at NDSU. And so with the classification, the physical properties of the textiles include the four fundamentals of textile study: fiber type, yarn construction, fabric construction, or finish. And so the fibers that were found were wool, and many of the shawls, especially the ones for cold weather, were wool. As we get into more current times, well, into the turn of the 20th century, cotton or wool cotton blends were used. Flax was found within the warp yarns of hand-woven shawls. Silk was found in head shawls. And so it's interesting to think about the natural fibers were what was available then. Rayon was available, but that was not present in the shawls that were shown that I had a chance to study. With the construction, yarn construction, without getting into the weeds about how yarns are made, I classified them as either hand spun or factory spun. And this was done in part by taking a look at the yarns of the fabric to see if there was irregularities in the spinning. And so hand spinning, you tend to have to stop as you feed the spun yarn onto the spool. And so a lot of times you'll see a thick and a thin spot. It depends on how things are carded, where the wool is straightened out and attenuated. With factory spun yarns are very uniform and very consistent. And so that was how yarn construction was classified. With fabric construction, what the shawls were created by either hand weaving or machine weaving. And so with weaving, we have two different sets of yarns, one that goes through the loom, and we call that the warp yarn. And a warp yarn can be long enough to weave just one textile, or it can be strung with many lengths needed to create 3 or 4 shawls or other pieces of fabric at a time. With machine woven textiles, many thousands of yards of warp yarn can be wound onto the warp beam, and so you can make lots and lots and lots of yardage of fabric with machine woven textiles. With hand woven textiles, generally you're limited in the width or the crosswise direction of the fabric. And that's because one person generally is the weaver, and they have to be able to, with their wingspan, reach and throw the shuttle, which has the weft yarns, back and forth across the loom. And so with hand woven textiles, they're generally shorter than the height or the wingspan, which is kind of the height of a woman. So right around 5 feet, 60 inches, maybe a little bit more if somebody has a wider loom, but generally it's 4 to 5 feet is available for the maximum width of fabric. With machine woven fabric, the shuttle is thrown by a lever, and now they've sped it up with water jet loom or air jet loom. And so with machine woven textiles, the width as far as the wingspan of a person, there's not that limitation. And so with the machine woven textiles, 6 feet to 7 feet wasn't uncommon. With finishing, when you finish a fabric, when it comes off the loom, it needs to be set. And so with wool fabrics, when you take them off the loom, you get them wet and you allow them to shrink. And you can use some heat or moisture or agitation to actually full it or felt it to get the wool fibers to interlock. Dyeing, adding color to the fiber can be done as well with the hand woven fibers and the excuse me, the hand spun as well as factory spun yarns. Generally, the dyeing was done in the yarn stage. Brushing can be done if you have a fabric that's fuzzy like flannel. That's gone through a process where the surface of the fabric is brushed and many times then cut, so the pile like corduroys is an even height. Then fringing, knotting the fringe to create that movement with the small pieces of yarn was another thing that people did to finish. With the size, hand woven shawls, the weft or the crosswise, they were between 24 and 40 inches wide, so smaller than the wingspan of most adult women. The warp yarn was 72 to 84 inches long with hand woven. And so that depended on the length of the warp. And so a woman who is weaving could string up 3 times that or more of that length in order to weave more than one shawl. With the machine woven shoulder shawls, they were square and generally 6 to 8 feet, 72 to 84 inches square. And so quite a bit bigger. And they're cozier in the winter, but at the same time, they're heavier as well. The type of the woven structure with the hand woven shawls, plain weaves were common. And with the striped shawl, there is a weft face plain weave. And what that means is that the yarns are packed close together as they are thrown through the loom with the shuttle. And with the beater bar, the women or the weavers would really beat the yarn down so it covered the warp yarns completely. So what you'll see with the hand woven shawls that are striped is that if you kind of push the weft yarns apart, you'll see a colored warp yarn that generally is made out of linen or cotton, something that was strong enough to withstand all that tension as it's being woven. With the plaid shawls, they were an even plain weave. And so you could see the warp yarns, you could see the weft yarns. And to do this, you have to be really on your guard to make sure that you're not weaving tightly or loosely. And so you have to be an accomplished weaver and spinner if you are going to be weaving a plaid. With the machine woven plaid shawls, they were done with a twill weave, which is kind of what you see. There's kind of a diagonal pattern with that, like a blue jean denim. And then were also complex twill weaves where they had maybe a third warp yarn added to create a design or a color. And then with the woven borders, the supplemental warp and weft was used. And so those are the yarns that created the patterns that were brought through the fabric in the areas around the borders of the shawls. The head scarves measured 36 or 30 to 36 inches square, plus fringe. So here's an example of the hand woven striped shawls, and I'll show these first. I'll show the hand woven plaid shawls second. Then we'll move to factory made shawls, and then finally the head shawls. And so with the hand woven striped shawls, as you look at these, you see this beautiful array of colors, bright colors that almost hurt your eyes. And so it's interesting to see the vivacity of the colors and how when you think about color combinations in the color wheel, there are complementary colors. So red and green is a complement. And so you see that in kind of a blue-green with the shawl that's on the left, and on the one that's upper right, you'll see more of a lime green. And so it's curious to take a look at the bright colors used in the hand-woven striped shawls. This is the first shawl that we received from Vaishilki. It's from 1885, and so it was part of the collection, starting in 1994, 1995. And so with this shawl, it has a 6-stripe repeat. So we'll talk about repeats a little bit more. But if you count the stripes between the light color, kind of a tan color, it's tan, red, dark green, red, blue, and red, and then tan starts again. So it's a 6-stripe repeat. As we look more closely, we can see the repeat on this shawl measures over 9 inches. And so we have, black and then red and blue and red and green and red. And then after the next one, I cut it off, but it would be black again. So one repeat were all those shawls. This too is a 6-stripe repeat. But what's so interesting about this is you can see kind of a little railroad type pattern and different small stripes that divide the wider stripe in half and create visual interest with that light and dark. And so it's interesting to learn a little bit about weaving and to see how the black railroad type stripe is created. And so aside from the warp yarns raising and lowering in a binary way, up or down, there are dowels at are tied to, to the various threads. And so with the arrow I'm pointing to these threads, they would be able to lift them up to throw the black yarn through. So you can get that little tiny variation that creates a real interest in the shawl pattern. It really dazzles the eye. This is a beautiful shawl. The other thing that this picture is good at is, as you look, you can see that these are really packed. These yarns are really packed. Then the other thing that is interesting is that you can see little flecks here and there, and it's a little bit uneven. And one of the things that um, Nina Farley Wishick, in her book Along the Trails of Yesterday, um, Tales of McIntosh County in North Dakota, she told about being part of German-Russian families. She was a school teacher and stayed with German-Russian families. And one of the things that they would do is buy dye stuffs from peddlers or from a general store in the United States, or catalog, and they would pound them. They would get their great big clay vats set up, or metal pots set up with water. They dissolve the dye stuff in the water, perhaps adding vinegar or some other chemical to make the wool fibers open up and accept the dyes better. Then they would set them in a pile of dried manure, and that was the material that burned to bring the temperature up on the water of the dye stuff. So they would get the dye dissolved, and then they would put the yarn in it. And so it would cook for 3 to 4 days, according to Wishick. And at the end of the time, when the pile of manure had ceased to burn, or if they pulled it away to cool it off, then they would get the yarn out. They'd have to rinse the yarn and make sure that the fugitive dye was removed. But you'd have these bright colors because the dye process was it brought the dye temperature up, the bath temperature up, to a point that the wool fibers open their dye sites up to receive, and then when they cooled the wool down, it held the dye stuff in there very, very well. This is over 100 years old, and the colors are still bright, like the day that they came out of off the loom. Then here is another shawl from the 1930s, and I think that this is so interesting to take a look at. This was donated by Ermina Janner, and she was from the Dobrushka colony of Romania. And they were Catholic Germans who early on settled in the 1814s in Bessarabia. But then as land became short and the Ottoman Empire, with the wars between them and the Russians won land in the Dobrushka area. They took advantage of that and moved to Romania, that portion of the world, in the mid 1800s. And so, the people traveled with their cultural knowledge, including textile weaving and dyeing knowledge. But it's interesting to see how there still is the same stripe pattern, but we don't have the detailed black railroad pattern that divides the stripes. And so it's curious to see. It still is a 6-stripe repeat, but we have a little variation in the 80 or so years that people were separated, but continued the traditions. With the hand-woven plaid shawls, we see the bright colors again, but you can see how these shawls were woven to get really close to perfect squares in the fabric. And so it's interesting, to see how these shawls were created. Now, this one you can see up in towards the upper right corner, there are 2 spots that have been mended. And then there's a fringe that was added with a commercially available yarn at a later date. And so the hand-woven plaid shawls were really, something to be proud of. They were lighter weight shawls for use doing during the summer, cooler nights in the summer or before it got really cold in the fall. They're generally a little bit thinner. The yarns are spun with a bit of crepe, and so when you feel these the fabrics, they're very lively. They feel really good, and all of that makes it difficult to weave. And so they're really, quite the showpiece of a woman's skills. Here's another example of a plaid shawl. And you can see that with these, there's the red stripe and the green stripe, and then there's a violet yarn that kind of tames down the colors. The previous one, you can see the violet a little bit more clearly, but with this one, it's a bit more subtle. This has a crochet edge that was added later. It's a beautiful shawl. So other colors are used as well. Here is a shawl from the collection of Edith Grossans-Gribli from the early 1900s. She was from the village of Tarantino in Bessarabia. And with this shawl, we have blue and white, but still there's that same broad stripe with two thinner stripes to create, kind of a blurring between the plaids. And again, the crochet edge was added later. Right now, so those are the two types of hand-woven shawls, or plaid and then striped. With the factory-made shawls, we have factory-made shawls with woven borders, as we see an example here. This shawl has been folded in half in the way in which it was worn. So it was worn as a rectangle. And you can see the different floral patterns that form the edges. This was acquired through the marketplace. The family originated in a small village to the south and east of Odessa. And so the family believed it was purchased by the mother in about 1908. And then they made their way to the United States. This is an interesting shawl because when we open it up, you can see that wear mark in the middle. And so that was one of the things that you looked at. It didn't show workmanship so much, but it did show use. And then that gave you a hint about the way in which the shawl was worn. So fold lines were useful. It didn't just show the way that it was folded for storage, but also in this case, we know from that it was worn around the shoulders in that fashion, not in a triangular fashion. and so the family remembered the mother wearing this around her shoulders, but over the coat. And so it added some warmth to a coat when in the extreme cold of North Dakota. And it does get pretty cold here, sub-zero temperatures. This is kind of fun to look at in the lower right. You see the back side of the shawl that's white. And then here's the front stripe. And so, there's a really close match of this corner of flowers. But, it's interesting to see that it isn't a complete double cloth. This just has one, extra sets of yarn, but it's not a true double cloth. With this shawl, it is a true double cloth. This shawl came from the collection of Carol Just, and from the area north Bessarabia and the Glickstall colony. And this one is reversible. And so a double cloth is a fabric that a true double cloth looks the same on the front side as the back side, and contains a pattern of some sort. And so with this shorter horizontal picture, you see the front side and then the back side of the stripes. And so the way that this has been folded, and they look, pretty much the same. It's interesting to see the stripes of this shawl are similar to the stripe pattern of the hand-woven shawls. And so it's curious to see. Here's another example of factory-made shawls with woven borders. This one has a little bit more of an abstract pattern, and it has fringe that goes all the way around the textile. When you look at the fringe up close, you can see that it's been added, and so threaded through the fringe and then tied in an interesting fashion. This one was worn by Christina Zingenhagel Cruzy on her trip to America, and then also in Artis, South Dakota. This is also from the Glickstahl colony. These types of shawls were available through catalogs in the United States. And so they were purchased. The families know that they were brought over, during, and so purchased in Russia, but brought to America and used in America. But if you needed a new one or wanted one for, a new growing woman, as a gift, you could get them through the Montgomery Ward's catalog, the Sears catalog, or J.C. Penney. All of those catalog retailers developed in the United States because of the homesteading patterns. That the homesteaders, could, if they proved up their 160-acre claim, they had to build a house and then, plow X number of acres of land each year and make improvements on that land. But 160 acres is a quarter-mile square. And so you could have 4 villages or 4 houses together on the corner of each of the section of the quarters, but it was much more widely distributed. The population was more widely distributed than in Russia, where there was a central village that then radiated out in spokes from that central village, so that each person had kind of a wedge-shaped set of properties. And so with this particular shawl and with mail order, it developed as a way for people to get goods from bigger cities, into the countryside, and people appreciated that. It came along with the improved transportation, the railroads. It came along with homesteading. It came along with industrialization, and the fact that textile processing was one of the first industries that the Industrial Revolution focused on, because it was so time consuming. So we have 2 different prices with these shawls, $3.59 and $5.49. The one that is in the $5 range is thicker and heavier. And because of that, it's pricier. So the weight of a textile is one of the ways that our price will go up. A 4th type of shawl is a factory-made plaid shawl. And so plaid shawls were popular as well. And with this, the way that this shawl is folded, the short little triangles that are shown, those would be the ends that would be brought around to the front of the body and either held or perhaps pinned. But as I interviewed people, they never talked about pinning their shawls, and we don't see evidence of pin marks on the shawls of the German Russians. And so people may have pinned them in some way, but according to what I have learned, heard from the families and seen, I don't think that was widely done. And so with this particular shawl, this is really a beautiful piece. It was acquired in 1914 and folded to make a triangle. So the point of the triangle would hang down the back of the woman and touch about at the knee level. So it was a big textile and looked pretty with a full skirt. Here is a closer images of the textile, the one on the left, and it shows the back of the fabric and the front of the fabric. So the clearer looking plaid with the predominantly green, black, and white stripes, they show on the face of the fabric. But on the back, you can see that there's a red stripe that kind of brings a brownish cast to the green colors. And so this was worn for many years. And then as cars became more common, Teresa Mackwald, who donated this shawl, remembered it being used in their car. And it is a beautiful shawl. It has no holes in it. They took really good care of it, and it wore really well. Here are 2 other factory-made plaid shawls. The one that's on the left, that's brown and kind of a lighter rust color. You can see the blue stripe running through it. And with that particular shawl, it was worn by a young woman traveling to America in 1911. With the shawl that's on the right, it's a lighter color, but again, you can see the borders of the plaid. And that was from the Closets Bessarabia. The family first lived near Bodle, South Dakota, then moved to Washington State, and then on to Lodi, California. And so after people moved to South Dakota or North Dakota, many of them found it too cold. And so they moved to the west, to Washington State, Oregon, or Lodi was a very popular place. And so there were a lot of German Russians there in the early portion of the 20th century. The fifth kind of shawl is a factory-made ticle, or head shawls. And so you can see the three different shawls that have different types of fringe that have been tied to the shawls. And so the fringe of these shawls does not emerge from the yarns of the fabric. These are threaded through and added to the fabric. And you can see that there are differing complexities in the way that the fringe has been tied. And so this helps people to identify their shawl from others, but also, a more complex fringe would be more expensive. And so it was a way to show status as well. Another type of shawl that falls into this head shawl category is a jacquard silk ticle. This one originated from Beresina in Bessarabia and was Catherine Becker Waltz's best shawl. And so it has an interesting diamond or lozenge pattern. Silk jacquard weaving originated and was invented in the early 1800s. The looms were brought to Russia in the 1840s, and the companies that made the machines, they wanted people to buy them, so they advertised them and marketed them. The advantage of a jacquard loom is that every yarn in the weft direction can be manipulated to get very big and complex patterns. And so the corner of the shawl has this fleur-de-lis pattern. You don't really see it on the wide full view, but as you look more closely, you can see that. And so it's interesting to see. And so this was a woman's best shawl. And the fact that it survived gives me the idea that she probably had more than one best shawl, because it lives on. Then a very familiar type of shawl is this floral pattern, the floral or Russian ticle. And so, this particular one that you see pictured originated from Beresina, Bessarabia, and was brought to America by the Helfenstein family in the early 1900s. And you can see these women that are pictured, it's a picture that was pulled from the Harper's Weekly magazine from the mid-1890s of German Russian women on Market Day in Eureka, South Dakota. You can see that they are wearing the floral patterned ticle. And these floral shawls are still available today. And so an important question is, how do you know how a flat textile is worn on a three-dimensional body? Well, through photographs or by visiting with somebody who remembers how they were worn by their grandmothers or their mothers. And so I did have demonstrations of women wrapping head shawls. They would show me how they carried the baby with the shawls and helped to distribute the weight. But the demonstrations were good. I wish I had a video camera at that time to get that. But the photographs are useful as well. And so photographs of women wearing ticle are more commonly found. And it's interesting to consider that. So headscarves were a very important part of German Russian women's dress. And so it's considered to be a modal type, so that's that Roche and Musa. And so the modal type, it helps people to see that during a particular time, people refer visually and in their minds to similar forms of dress. You certainly see that in the two women sitting having lunch in the colored photograph, where they have the scarf loosely tied under their chin. And in the photograph on the right-hand side, it shows a similarity in the way that the scarves are sized as well as worn by the women that are pictured here. The shawls are also a form of shibboleth. And a shibboleth is a way to identify membership within a group. And so it's a custom that distinguishes a particular class or group of people. And so it's interesting to see the women that are from the Dobrushka colony of Kolilia, they are all wearing shawls. And this was Christmas Day, and they were greeting people that were women that were arriving at the St. Ludwig's convent. The women had been escorted by the Red Cross in a way that allowed them more care, whereas the majority of the Kolilia villagers traveled up the Danube River in a boat. But you can also see there are two women behind that are not wearing scarves, and here's a young woman that's not wearing a scarf. And so there was that kind of difference in the headscarf traditions. But this was a holy day, Christmas Day, and it was a special occasion, greeting the villagers that had been separated during the time of travel. And so headscarves are an important part of grooming practices of the Germans from Russia. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were a way to show modesty. People's best headscarves were saved for church. This picture of the three girls from the Krasna Project photo collection show girls that are about the age of confirmation. And so there's not information that's written about this picture, but I speculate that perhaps they were prepared to take part in the ceremony of confirmation, the ritual confirmation within the Lutheran Church. or perhaps the Catholic Church. With the picture that's on the left, Carolina Sackman is wearing a beautiful headscarf tied loosely at the front, but folded in an interesting way to kind of tuck by the head and then to bring the fabric around the front. And she's wearing it at her husband's funeral. And so this is from 1925. And so with the grooming practices, Nina Faralik-Wishik talked about how once a week, women would brush their hair out, and their hair would have been braided and then tied in a bun for the course of the week. But on Saturdays, they would take time to brush their hair out. And so the scarves were off. They would start to brush or comb their hair. And if there were snarls or if the hair felt dry, they would oil it up with butter or lard. And the hair was just, she said, a halo of loveliness, and she loathed to see it braided up again. But by braiding it, it kept the hair confined and protected with the scarf. And so it was a grooming practice that was important. And as I gave one presentation in Jamestown, a woman who was probably in her 80s came and told me that she would do that for her grandmother every Saturday night and comb her hair out lovingly. And that she would help her grandmother braid her hair. They'd roll it back into a bun, and then she'd put the scarf on every morning, before she went about her day. With shoulder shawls, it was harder to find a picture of the way that shoulder shawls were worn, but they provided warmth. They were heavier, they were wider, they were longer than the head shawls, and they helped to distribute carried child's weight. And so with both of the women pictured here, you can see that on the left side, there's kind of a tuck of the shawl under the woman's arm. And in both cases, you see that, but it's more clear in the striped shawl that's to the left. You also see that the angle of the shawl is skewed. And so the shawl does not hang straight down. It's been angled in order to take advantage of the stretch of the fabric and allowing it to be tucked and worn more readily. And so this was from the Dobrushka German women joining the families in 1940. here's a front picture of these two women. One, you see the baby's face revealed, the other one, the face is still covered. And you can kind of see how under the child that is on the right in the black and white photograph, how underneath the baby, shawl fabric is tucked under the baby's weight. And so, right in this picture, I'm not able to tell, but the right arm might be free. And so that's one of the things that I need to look back on a little bit more. But anyway, you can see how, keeping the left arm down and then tucking this fold of fabric under the baby helps to, keep the weight and make it easier to carry the child, and then cover the child to keep it warm. The interesting thing is this red and bright green and black and blue shawl is shown here. And so this is the same shawl, and it's really a wonderful thing to have an example of the colors. They don't show up in black and white, but to actually have that as a physical example is really a wonderful addition. So hand woven striped fabrics are found in many parts of the world. And so, in the area of the Ukraine where Bessarabia, parts of Bessarabia are from, still today, you can see that here are striped shawls worn by Ukrainian women, but they are worn as aprons and wrapped around the body. As you look closely, you'll see a variety of thicknesses of stripes. It doesn't have that same 6-stripe repeat. And you can also see, excuse me, kind of an arrowhead or a different design woven into the stripes. And so there's a difference in these people that may have lived in similar areas of the country. But shawls served women from cradle to grave, just like textiles do for us today. When we're born, we're wrapped in textiles. When we die in textiles for the most part, and we wear them all the way through. They're so common, they're ubiquitous. Everybody has them. We hardly even think about them now. And so it's interesting to consider. And so where did the families with shawls originate? Well, I plotted those out. And one of the interesting things that emerged is that the hand-woven shawls were from villages around the Kolgalik River in present-day Moldova. And so with the Kolgalik River, it is a river that flows, into the Black Sea. And so you can see where the yellow highlights are. These are all villages where the hand-woven shawls came from. This doesn't include the Dabrushka shawl. That one, when I did my original study, I didn't have access to that. And it might be as time goes on that there are wider areas that make use of this cultural tradition. But with these areas, fiber processing skills were needed by women when they migrated in 1814 or after. They were needed to be a successful wife and mother and partner in the family unit. The families at this time, the families that were allowed to settle in this part of the world after 1814, needed to be self-sufficient. And so a home-based economy where people created the things they needed was something that the agents looked for before they approved a family traveling into this portion of the world, into Russia. And so with Russian society, status is communicated in dress. With Russian sumptuary laws that ended in the 1860s, rural peasants could wear traditional clothing in the countryside, but if they went to the cities, they had to wear European style clothing. And so, German colonists had special privileges, and they lived in small villages, and so their dress identified them as German colonists and free peasants. But these forces, the Russianizing forces, were at work on the German colonists. Schultz talked about German colonies being islands within a Slavic sea in Russia. So the Industrial Revolution and development of cash economy was certainly one of the things that occurred. There was emancipation of the peasants in Russia that created upheaval, the end of the colonist privileges that fostered um, emigration out of Russia, the Homestead Act in the United States that lured people into this part of the world, into the United States. All those things were creating pulls and changes. And so the question that can be asked is was there a need for women to blend in physically with others through their dress? Quite possibly, perhaps these hand-woven, brightly colored shawls that once, proudly expressed their identity, perhaps they were, ways that people identified them and ostracized them. It's speculation purely, but it's certainly possible. And could this have fostered the adoption of factory-made shawls? It could have, but individual preferences and the desire to have something that was more store-bought versus homemade could have fostered that adoption as well. There's lots of different things that could do that, but it's curious. In World War II, there was the displacement of the German colonists. Here, Edith Groshand-Greebly's mother is carrying her, being escorted by a soldier and a Red Cross volunteer. She has a shoulder or a head shawl that's wrapped around and helping her to carry Edith, who developed a sickness on the transport from Trentino by wagon to where they met the trains to take them into Germany. And so shawls symbolize femininity and motherhood. With the head shawls, they also, gave an expression of modesty. They're part of dress practices. The shoulder shawls were an aid in caring for the children. And the shawls reflect German, from Russia, women, and their roles as mothers and their importance in caring for and managing their families. And an interesting thing that came up as I visited with women who own the shawls were always passed on the female side of the family. And so, that was something that was always mentioned as we were visiting and I was having a chance to meet with the families that own shawls. The shawls were reused as fabric. And so this is an interesting picture. The grandmother, Salamino Job, was a midwife in the Linton, Strasbourg area. She had many grandchildren. And in this picture in 1920, her granddaughter that's shown here made use of a shawl to make a skirt. And so the shawls and fabric, anything that was used by the Germans, especially the textiles, there was the belief that they should last as long as possible and that you should use things up. They were sustainable before that was even considered a word. And so it's interesting how they changed, as they were no longer used as shawls. They could be used as daybed covers, piano drapes, fabric for skirts, ironing board covers, quilt linings, rag rugs. And so it's interesting how they developed a life beyond just being a whole textile. They were used from the 19th century into the first half of the 20th century. So it's curious to see the length that happened. Today, the shawls preserve the history of the families and serve as a reminder of German Russian ancestors. And so I want to thank Angia and the University of Madison for their support with the symposium. And so I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.